probably time we got started. So welcome everybody. I'm recording this one, so we'll put it on the website for everybody that's running a bit late or can watch a bit later on. Apologies from Chris. He's doing a meeting tonight with the one of the leaders of one of the caravan clubs. They're trying to organise a safari to coincide with the Rotary conference in Sydney next year. So, and they want to do their own safari from Sydney to Brisbane, and want us to look after them from Brisbane all the way up to Cairns and then back again. So he's sitting in on a meeting trying to sort out all the nuts and bolts for that one. Ian also sends his apologies because his nursery, nursery got flooded, so he's up to his armpits in crocodiles at the moment trying to figure out what to do and fix all of his things. So, and he's also in the middle of a power blackout, so while his mobile is working, not much else is, so he's not with us as well tonight. So I'd like to welcome Mike. He's here to talk to us about organ transplants today. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Mike and welcome. Thanks for coming.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I've also got Mary Campbell, who's I'm a doctor at Tweed Hospital. I'm an intensive care specialist, but I've got an interest in organ donation, and I've got Mary Campbell. She's our organ donation specialist nurse sitting next to me as well. So thanks for asking us to come and talk to you. Can you all hear me all right?
Yes, all good.
Good.
Yeah.
And can you see the screen? What can you see the
PowerPoint is up on everybody's screen.
Yep,
we're all good.
I'm going to talk about organ donation, and I want to show you a picture of Amy. So Amy was born with a condition called biliary atresia, and here she is, 3 months of age. She had a liver transplant when she was very, very young. She was only less than a month old. We've got a picture of her 3 months of age, another one with her 7 months of age. And this is Amy just a few years ago. So she's doing amazingly well. This here is Alira. Alira is a girl who goes to Palm Beach High School, and she was one of our patients about a year or so ago. She came in, basically a normal girl, suddenly got sick one weekend, came in yellow and jaundiced, and she ended up in the intensive care unit, being intubated, ventilated on a life support machine. And she also had fulminant liver failure, and she had less than 24 hours to live. So luckily she went on the transplant list and managed to pick up a liver within 4 to 6 hours of her actually going on the list, and without that she wouldn't be alive today. And this is a picture of her helping us promote organ donation and transplantation to the public, and it is something we're continuing to try and promote. It's a really useful thing for society, but it's also a fascinating field medically, and I'm really open to any questions at any time. So what I was going to talk to you about was what happens during an organ donation, what do we do in the hospital, some myths and misconceptions people have about organ donation, what we in Australia are doing about trying to improve our organ donation, and also what you can do to help us with that. Well, what functions people in the community have as, towards helping us improve organ donation. So I'll start off by telling you a bit about what happens during an organ donation. So as I said earlier, I'm an intensive care specialist, and this would be a typical patient in intensive care. He's on a ventilator, on a life support machine, surrounded by monitors, and we look after these patients, try the best we can to save their lives. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't manage to do that, and they die whilst they're in the intensive care unit. So in the unit that I work in, we manage to save about 80% of our patients, but we do have, unfortunately, a 20% mortality. Organ donation really applies to those 20% who don't pull through. We can go through a process of using their organs to help save other lives. You've already seen some of the recipients that we've had. This here is this is a lady. She was one of our first organ donors, and she presented after a very severe asthma attack where she collapsed and went blue at home after doing some housework. And the dust, I think, from the sofa, she'd been reupholstering it, had a bad effect on her, and she had a sudden collapse. She suffered a cardiac arrest, and it took an hour and a half to 2 hours before her heart could be restarted. During that time, she had no circulation to her brain, no blood flow to her brain, and her brain had died. So her brain was no longer functioning. So she was on one of the ventilators that we saw on the previous slides. We waited for 3 to 4 days hoping that she was going to wake up, but we soon realized that she'd actually died. She died of brain death, and her husband, when we spoke to him, generously agreed that this lady, Naomi, could become an organ donor, and she donated her liver. Her liver went to a 40-year-old man down in Sydney, 2 kidneys. I'm not sure where they went. Our last donor, 2 kidneys went off to 2 children who were 8 and 9, and they had the opportunity of coming off dialysis and living a more normal life. The last donor that we had, the heart went down to Melbourne and helped a young kid as well, saved his life. So we see both sides of the coin. We see the organ donors and we see the organ recipients, and they're both incredibly complex medical patients. So this here is a little picture just describing some of the organs that we can transplant. The heart, the lungs, the liver, the kidney and the pancreas. Those organs depend very much on blood flow being present. They can't survive very long out of the body. So once we've removed the heart from somebody's body, for example, we cool it down to about 4 degrees Celsius and have to transplant it within 6 hours for it to be viable. The lungs, similarly, 6 to 12 hours. The liver, 6 to 12 hours. The kidneys are a little bit more robust and they can survive up to 24 hours, but preferably being transplanted earlier. Otherwise, they start to suffer damage if they're outside the body and not without any circulation for too long. So just try to give you a little bit of a rundown of what organ donation is all about. And a lot of people in the community are a bit unsure about organ donation. The concept of death is not an easy one for people to talk about and think about. And also there's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of fear about what goes on. So I thought I'd just go through some of the common misconceptions, but I'm happy if anybody wants to ask a question and say, look, I've always wondered why you do this, or what the problems are when you have certain situations, then please just ask. I'm happy to stop talking. So myth number 1, I'm too old to be an organ donor. It would probably surprise you to know that between 5 and 10% of all our organ donors are over 75 years old, and the majority are over 50. So we always think of organ donation as being young people who are involved in car crashes. Well, that's not actually true. Most people who are organ donors have had a stroke and become organ donors after a stroke or a cerebral hemorrhage. Myth number 2. Will I be dead when I become an organ donor? People are very concerned about that, and I can assure you 100% that we would never remove organs of somebody who isn't dead. So if you sign up to organ donation, yes, you will be dead, and we go through huge safeguards to ensure that our patients are dead. That may have come out a little bit wrong. We don't ensure they're dead. We check that they're dead before we put them up for organ donation. And that process is very complex. There's a whole series of clinical tests. We have scans, and you can see the scan here. Can you see my pointer on the screen?
Yep. Yep.
And all the white here is cerebral hemorrhage. This patient's had a awful cerebral hemorrhage. You see here an MRI. That's a massive stroke. This patient here has had stroke. And here we're looking at dilated pupils. We're checking to see if the patient's bleeding. We have to go through a whole series of blood tests and to find out that that they're dead before they can become an organ donor. We need 2 doctors to examine the patient. They have to be senior doctors. You can't just have a junior doctor. And they both have to declare that the patient meets the Harvard criteria for brain death. And if there's any doubt, here is a typical test that we can do. It's called a cerebral angiogram. So there's 4 main blood vessels that supply the brain of a human. Here's one. This is the internal carotid. I'm not sure whether it's the left or right, but you can see we've injected a little bit of radio-opaque dye into the carotid, and you can see that the brain is well perfused here with blood, and this would be a normal cerebral angiogram showing blood flow. And we can do this for all 4 vessels of the brain, so the 2 carotids, the left and right, the 2 vertebral arteries that come up a little further back, and so we do it 4 times, take the x-rays, scan the brain to see if there's any blood flow. And the picture I've got here on the left shows a patient whose brain has died, and I think that's a reasonably convincing image that there is absolutely no blood flow. You can see it coming up the carotid here, and there's just no blood flow in the brain at all. So this patient unfortunately has died and could potentially become an organ donor. Some other myths that we commonly hear. If I sign up for organ donation, they won't try so hard to save me. Well, I really hope that nobody believes that. We in the medical profession and nursing profession, we do everything we can to look after our patients, and it's only when the patients have died that they can become an organ donor. None of my organs are worth it. Some people think that they're too sick or not healthy enough. For example, people are diabetic or may have renal failure, but it probably surprised you that most people have organs that can be transplanted and be of use to other people after their death. Doctors are paid for organ donors, i.e. there's a myth that doctors have some financial incentive to have organ donors. That's entirely untrue. There's no payment for an organ donor. My family will be traumatized by my being an organ donor. Now that is interesting. There's no doubt that most families, if they have a loved one who dies, it's a very upsetting time. But there's also no doubt that in my experience, those families who agree for their loved one to become an organ donor, they find it incredibly reassuring or rewarding that they could have helped somebody else, and that their loved one who's now dead has actually helped somebody else to live. So usually the comment that we have is, look, the death of my mother, my husband, my son, whoever it may have been, was one of the most awful experiences of my life. I'm grieving terribly, but at least I have something good that has come out of it, which was the fact that they became an organ donor and helped somebody else to live after their death. And we do take great care to look after the families of our organ donors. We have bereavement counsellors. and the whole process is done in a very sensitive way. An organ donation operation is like any other operation that you may go through. So there's a scar down the middle of the body, and then after the operation has happened and the organs have been removed, the patient's stitched up again, and the family can go and sit with their loved one after they've died. So another myth, my family won't know if I've saved the lives of others. That's not true. We let the families of any organ donor know what good has come out of their decision. So there's a few myths and misconceptions, and I might just have a pause now and just ask if there's any questions in any of the people who are out there.
Yeah, I have one, Mike. You said before that the pancreas is a viable organ for donation. Does that mean type 1 diabetes sufferers can have a pancreas transplant and not have to worry about insulin dependency anymore?
That's absolutely right. Pancreatic transplantation is still very much in its infancy. It hasn't been perfected yet. There have been a few that have been done in Australia, and they're usually only done in conjunction with a renal transplant. So if there's a type 1 diabetic who's having a kidney transplant, then it's possible to also transplant the pancreas as well.
Because of what the upside isn't guaranteed well enough yet to warrant the operation by itself, but in conjunction with the other one, it's doing.
That's right. That's right. I mean, anybody who receives an organ transplant has to undergo a course of immunosuppression, so their own immune system has to be suppressed to some extent, so they don't reject this organ as foreign tissue. And that in itself carries some risk. A small risk, but nevertheless a risk. So given that pancreatic transplantation is still in its infancy, still being developed, the decision has been made that it's only going to be done in conjunction with another organ at this stage.
Okay.
But yes, essentially a type 1 diabetic can be cured.
That's awesome. Very cool. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Yes, it's Wendy here. Some people think that eyes, like corneas, are an organ that's donated, but you can donate your cornea, but it's not passed over the eye as an organ as such.
I didn't quite hear you there, Wendy. I wonder if anybody else has heard her and can repeat it.
Can you get closer to the mic, Wendy, or maybe type your question, perhaps?
I think she was asking about the corneas.
Ah, yes.
So with regards to the eyes.
Yes. So
Is that
I
right,
think
Wendy?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, so Wendy, I can answer that question easily. The solid organs are very susceptible to ischemia, which is lack of blood flow, and that would be the kidneys, the heart, the lungs, and so forth. Now, the cornea we classify as a tissue, not an organ, and tissue is more robust, doesn't depend on the blood flow, and a cornea can be removed from someone's body up to 24 hours after they've died. So it doesn't have to be done immediately, and it can be stored for a few days before it's transplanted. But it is an amazing thing, a corneal transplant. You get people who are blind who can then see again. The cornea, which is the clear window at the front of the eye, can become diseased for a variety of reasons, and that's then cut out in a circle, and an identical sized circular transplant is put in its place and stitched in, and all of a sudden that those people can see again. So it is an incredible thing, the corneal transplant.
Do you need 20/20 vision to donate corneas?
No, not at all. In fact, most people who are corneal donors, we don't really know what their vision is. You do need to have clear corneas naturally, but not 20/20 vision, no. Does anybody out there have any friends or relatives who've received a transplant?
No.
It's quite surprising because most people know somebody who's had a transplant.
Oh,
And one of the things...
we were at Club Med and we met a guy there that had a kidney transplant, so he was just another co-holiday maker, but yeah, we haven't really seen him since, but that's about the only contact we've had with a transplant, I think.
But I mean, interesting fact that, I mean, my remit is to talk about organ donation, and my specialization is looking after the organ donors and trying to promote organ donation and try and counteract some of the myths about organ donation. But in fact, we're all 6 times more likely to be the recipient of a transplant and the benefit from the transplant than we are to be an organ donor. And the reason for that is because each person who dies and becomes an organ donor can donate up to potentially 10 organs, which can benefit other people. So we're all much more likely to benefit from this scheme than we are to become an organ donor.
Oh, hang on, we have a question actually.
So, if Wendy here again, do they still prefer the organ donor to be younger than the recipient?
No, not at all. We do, before an organ is transplanted, there is an assessment made of all sorts of things, not only how well the organ's functioning, but also the blood group of the donor and whether that's going to be compatible with the recipient, the need. So if you've got somebody who's in urgent need of an organ, like Alira, I told you about Alira, she had less than 24 hours to live, then in that case the transplant surgeons are not in a position to be so choosy, and really any organ will do, so to speak, whereas a patient who is less sick, they can be a little bit more choosy about which organs they might prefer.
I have a question about how long it takes. Like, I am an organ donor, but a lot of my friends, they say, oh no, it'll take too long after I die, and so my family have to stay around the hospital for an extended period of time after I've died while they harvest my organs.
Yeah. Look, there is some truth in that. After somebody has died, it takes us about 12 hours to go through the whole process of organising the organ donation. So it can take about 12 hours longer. Rather than, so the classical scenario would be we have somebody in our intensive care unit, they're on a life support machine, they die, we keep ventilating them, we keep looking after them, even though they've died. And that will be typically for about 12 hours more. So yes, it can take a bit longer. During that time we do support the families, and it can be a little bit stressful for the families at that time, but in retrospect we've never had anybody come back the next day and said, look, that was an awful time. Some people actually value that time that they can spend with their loved one at the bedside. And so whilst it can be a bit stressful at the time, the families never come back and complain about it. In fact, they usually we have very positive comments about the fact that they have one of their family members has become an organ donor. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
So just thought I'd touch briefly on what's happening in Australia, organ donation in Australia. So here's a slide showing the international donor statistics, and you can see Australia in this is number of donors per million of population, and you can see Australia is relatively low down internationally. In actual fact, if you'd seen the 2009 statistics, our donors per million of population is less than 10. So 2010 was already an improvement.
Donors per million. So what? There's 13. You mean 13%, right? Not 13 per million.
No, we're talking 13 per million.
Seriously? That's incredible.
Unbelievable.
Incredibly low.
Is that a trend that you see? So, say 2010, say 2011 figures, are they available to you to see if that's trending upward?
Yeah. So we in 2011 it's 14.8, I think it was, and in 2012 we've gone up to 15.6. I've got Mary next to me showing me the figures, but that's approximately right. So we're going up about 10% a year at the moment. And yes, you're right, it is per million of population. It does seem very low. And the reason it's so low is because it's quite a rare event to become an organ donor. So in the whole of Australia last year, we only had 354 organ donors.
Oh, so you're talking about not card-carrying donors, but actual people that donate organs?
That's right, yes.
Okay.
How many people died in this year?
So within the population, about 20% of people have signed up on the organ donor registry as card-carrying donors, and the other 80% haven't made any preference, and there's a small number who have elected not to become donors.
That's still
So
20%.
this is the number of people. So in the whole of Australia, we've had 354 people died and became organ donors last year. For us, if we have somebody who can potentially be an organ donor, it is a very big thing, and large numbers of people benefit from it. Well, as I said, up to 6 people have their lives saved from every single donor.
So how many more lives would be saved every year if you had an unlimited number of donors? Like if everybody that was able to donate did, what sort of effect would that have on the people, the recipients? Would they get to the point where you have too many organs, or is that not?
Yeah.
You know what I'm trying
Okay,
to say?
so the numbers. So within Australia, there's about 75,000 people die in hospital each year, and of those, only 790 are suitable to become organ donors because of the way they've died. So in order to become a solid organ donor, a person has to die in an intensive care unit on a ventilator.
Okay, so you're basically getting half of the available at the moment.
So we're getting half of the available organs,
Okay.
half the potential donors in Australia. We think that's the best statistics we've got.
That sort of puts it in a bit more perspective, I think. Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah. I mean, you can see that countries like Spain and Portugal have very high donation rates. We in Australia have obviously looked at their systems. We know that in the 1980s, their donation rate was similar to where we are now. And they instituted a system that we have instituted in Australia, which is a system of promotion, trying to promote organ donation, trying to make sure that it's that we manage it all properly, and as a result of that, they've had a 10 to 15% increase year on year. Now, I don't know if anybody's aware, but Kevin Rudd actually is a recipient of a heart valve. And in 2008, when he was the Prime Minister, he set up a national organ donation agency to try and improve our record in Australia in terms of organ donation. So that started in 2009, and since 2009 we've had roughly a 50% increase in our donation rate.
And did he succeed? Yep.
Did he succeed? Kevin Rudd.
Yes.
Well, Kevin Rudd. I mean, Kevin Rudd's had 2 heart valve transplants now, and he's doing well. And we have had a 50% increase in 4 years, approximately.
Which is great. Yes.
Well, I guess so. We obviously every donor comes with a sad story, but the one thing that we're trying to promote in Australia is not to miss the donors. We feel it's a tragedy that people who could potentially be organ donors who would like to be an organ donor and they get missed. And if they're missed by the doctors or the nurses, or because their families don't understand their wishes, then, or because people have misconceptions and therefore refuse to be organ donors, then that to us is a tragedy. So part of our promotion is to educate the population and to let people know a little bit more about organ donation, and ask them to discuss it with their families, so their families will then know what their wishes are. So if in the event of a tragedy, the families can then consent to organ donation on their behalf.
Do you find that the biggest obstacle is not that people don't want to donate, but that when it comes down to it, the families disagree, or is that just something that I imagine happens? Or
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. So most people, when you talk to them, would say they're in favour of organ donation, and all the surveys show that more than 90% of Australians are in favour of organ donation.
Good joke.
But when it comes down to it, that people, when they are stressed, when they've got a loved one who's dying, and when they're asked about organ donation, that it sometimes seems to be an easier option to say no. And we have a consent rate of about 50%. So of all those people that we approach about organ donation, about 50% will consent and 50% refuse. And we recognize people's right to make that choice on behalf of their family member, and we also recognize the stressful situation that people find themselves in, which is one of the reasons we try to promote organ donation and the benefits, and to ask people to discuss it outside that stressful situation, because if people can think about organ donation at a time when they're relaxed in their living room or talking with their family, then it becomes a lot easier when they're faced with a stressful situation and one of their loved ones is dying.
I find it interesting, that the deceased maybe their last wishes to donate their organs, yet their relatives can overturn that.
Yes.
Surely you can't. It's their choice, and they should be the only ones making the decision. They've already made the decision.
Yeah. Look, that confuses a lot of people. We, as the people who are looking after the dying patient and also looking after the relatives, we find ourselves in a difficult situation sometimes. And the last thing we want to do when a grieving relative finds it too hard to come to terms with the fact that their loved one can be an organ donor, the last thing we want to do is to push them into it. So we take an attitude of being very gentle, and we much prefer to talk about it in a forum like this where we're all sitting on the end of a computer, fit and healthy, than to try and push or coerce people when they're in a stressful situation. And ultimately, I think that's a strategy that also will benefit us in the long run. We want to be seen as an organisation that's caring, kind, and supportive towards our patients, We don't want to be seen as an organisation that's pushy and trying to grab organs of dying people. That's not the image we want to create. We want to be seen as caring and supportive people. So I think in the long run we will win more friends and have a longer lasting benefit to the population if we follow the path we are following at the moment.
Mm. Fair enough.
It's an interesting ethical dilemma, though.
Mm.
So we'll just go to the next slide. So we do have a waiting list, and here's some kids on a waiting list, and there's a child who's had a transplant. I actually don't know that child.
This previous photo is in 18.
Is that right? So previous photo. Again a baby with liver. It seems to be that all the photos I'm showing you are of liver transplants, but in actual fact, it's just as common to see a heart transplant. We've got a wonderful woman in our area who, she was a school teacher in her 30s, a bit of a swimming champion as well. I think she'd swum for the state in swimming, and she had taught her grade 9 class how to do CPR. And a few weeks later, she ended up actually receiving CPR from those very same students that she'd taught how to do it. And she ended up having a heart transplant. And she's an amazing woman. She's a life force. And we bring her along to our talks sometimes if we're giving presentations, and she's just wonderful. I think she's standing for Parliament now, isn't she? She wants to be a federal MP, or is it a state MP? One or the other. She's a brilliant woman, but she's a heart transplant recipient. We've got lung transplant patients who sit there and they spread their arms and they go, "I love taking deep breaths. It feels so wonderful." One of them we know for a fact, because she was treated in our local area, probably wouldn't have survived to the end of the week without a transplant. We have kidney patients who are just grateful for not having to make that 3 times a week attendance to the renal dialysis unit, where they have to sit on the dialysis machine for 4 to 6 hours 3 times a week, and their life is freed up by this opportunity. So, I mean, the benefits are huge. Let me just so essentially, part of the talk and part of the reason we're keen to get the message out there is to try and dispel some of the myths about organ donation, but also to tell you some of the things that you can do to help. And I think we've already talked about it already, but I said earlier that 90% of Australians support organ donation, but 50% of the families refuse when asked. But we know that families that have had that discussion amongst themselves are much more likely to understand their loved one's wishes and much more likely to consent and to follow those wishes through. So we're encouraging everybody to discover the facts about organ donation, and thank you for attending this talk. So give me the opportunity to explain a little bit about it, to make your decision as to whether you want to be an organ donor, knowing the facts, and to talk about it essentially as widely as you can with your family, with your parents, your children, your grandchildren, and let them know your wishes and encourage them to make a decision themselves. And that for us is really our big message, that if we can get all of Australia talking about organ donation, making a decision, and have a national movement where it becomes accepted and normal to be an organ donor, that would be huge.
Mm.
Well, thank you, Mike, for coming along tonight and talking to us. Does anybody else have any other questions before we wrap it up?
No, I think it was great, and it certainly gave me something to think about. Sit down with my family, have a talk about it.
Yeah, I know us, our family, we've sat down and discussed who wants to give what, and I think we've decided everybody wants to give everything except one of us has decided that not her eyes, but otherwise she's good to go. So, but we all know what everybody wants, and we're both, we all tick the boxes on our license and all that kind of thing. So I just encourage everybody to do the same thing and let your families know what's going on. It's wonderful.
Do you think there's like perhaps a more not efficient is the word I'm going to use, but not the word that I mean, I guess, way of combating that issue between you know, family decisions at that final, you know, crunch point and the system that we have now? I mean, like, fantastic for people to talk about and discuss with their families, but like you said, it's often a far different situation when they actually have to make that decision. Is there something, you know, in like a legal sense of the word that could be done, or is that, you know, pushing the boundaries too far, do you think?
But so I'll just outline some of the things that have been discussed and thought about, and some of the other things that are being done as well. I mean, firstly, anybody who's involved in organ donation, we undergo extensive training on how to approach families of dying relatives, to put the message forward in an informative and acceptable way, but without being coercive. And it's quite difficult to choose the right words and to get the right tone, especially understanding that the families are stressed out at that time. And so that's one thing that's happened. What are some of the other things that we do?
If I can sort of just interject here, I'm just thinking that maybe
promote the discussion in the community.
You know, maybe at the time of the loved one dying, the last thing you want to do is add stress. So, you know, to
yeah, of course,
you know, live with their wishes is really something you're just going to have to deal with, because you know, you don't want to sort of pull out the patient's donor card and say, look, but they really did want to give you know, their organs. If the family's against it, you know, you don't want to create a scene and you know, add to their
we would raise that issue. So if we knew, for example, that somebody had registered a wish to be an organ donor on the organ donor registry, then I would be sitting with the family and saying, look, your husband himself wanted to be an organ donor, and that should help you come to a decision. You know, we'll be fulfilling his wishes and helping other people. So we do make the families aware of their family members' wishes, and that can be quite helpful in guiding them towards that decision. So signing up on the organ donor registry is very important and does help us and the family to know what their wishes are. Another thing that's been discussed a fair bit is the opt-in and opt-out system. So in some countries they have what we call an opt-out system. So it's automatically assumed that every citizen is going to be an organ donor unless they register that they don't want to be an organ donor. And other countries, which includes Australia, doesn't make that. We don't make that assumption. In actual fact, I'm not sure if it would make any difference. Spain does happen to be an opt-out system, and they do have the highest organ donation rate in the world. But their organ donation rate didn't change when they changed their legal system from opt-in to opt-out. It made no difference to the number of organ donations. The thing that really made a difference was community awareness, which has taken place over 30 years, and it's gradually evolved. And it's where we started about 3 years ago, following in their footpath. Some countries offer payment for for people who become organ donors. We think that has borderline ethics. Some countries like China use executed prisoners, for example, and they become organ donors, and again we think that's borderline, has borderline ethics. So I'm just outlining some of the strategies that have been used around the world. We prefer to keep it very clean, very ethical, very kind and very caring, concentrate on quality, and in that way hopefully the message gets out there that organ donation is not something to be feared.
Okay, I think we'll have to call it a night there. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us about it. As I said, this session has been recorded and will be available on our website probably about this time tomorrow. So anybody who else is in the club or wants to have a look at it is more than welcome to come and have a listen to the session. So thanks again, Mike. And does anybody else have anything to say before we call it a night tonight?
No, thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, well, thanks for inviting us online. And go home and have a chat with your family.
Number one.
Oh, and Mike, can you email me
Thanks,
the
guys.
PowerPoint, please? Would that be a problem?
Email the PowerPoint.
Yeah, that would be
Yeah.
great.
Mary, you've got the email.
Just
Yep.
President.
Yep.
I'm just typing
No problem.
so
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye, all.
Bye-bye.